Chapter 7. Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply. Aggregate Demand Aggregate Supply Model, ADAS for short, is the macroeconomic model that uses aggregate demand and aggregate supply to determine and explain the price level and the level of real domestic output. It enables us to analyze changes in real GDP and the price level simultaneously. The ADAS model provides keen insights on inflation, recession, unemployment, and economic growth. The aggregate demand curve is a schedule, or curve, that shows the total quantity of goods and services demanded at different price levels. There is an inverse relationship between the price level, as measured by the GDP price index, and real output demanded, real GDP. We can represent the aggregate demand, AD curve, as a downward sloping line. There are four main determinants of aggregate demand: consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net export spending. When these change, so does aggregate demand. For example, factors such as consumer wealth and real income affect aggregate consumer spending positively, and an increase in these factors would shift the AD curve to the right, while an increase in household indebtedness and taxes will have the opposite effect. Increases in real interest rate will raise borrowing costs for businesses and will lower investment. AD shifts to the left, while higher expected returns will increase investment and shift AD to the right. An increase in government spending will shift the AD curve to the right, as will factors that lead to increasing exports, such as rising national income abroad or dollar depreciation. Graphically, an increase in aggregate demand corresponds to the shift of the AD curve to the right, while the decrease in aggregate demand corresponds to the shift of the AD curve to the left. The aggregate supply curve is a schedule that shows the total quantity of goods and services supplied at different price levels. The aggregate supply curve in the short run and in the long run vary by the degree of wage adjustment. In the immediate short run, output and input prices are fixed, and the AS curve is horizontal. In the short run, output prices are flexible, while input prices are sticky. Thus, the AS curve is positively sloped. In the long run, all prices are flexible. Economy is at full employment. Output is equal to potential, and the AS curve is vertical. The immediate short-run aggregate supply curve is horizontal at the economy's current price level. With output prices fixed, firms collectively supply the level of output that is demanded at those prices. The upward-sloping short-run aggregate supply curve indicates a direct or positive relationship between the price level and the amount of real output that firms will offer for sale. The AS curve is relatively flat, below the full employment output, because unemployed resources and unused capacity allow firms to respond to price level rises with large increases in real output. It is relatively steep beyond the full employment output because resource shortages and capacity limitations make it difficult to expand real output as the price level rises. The long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical at the full employment level of real GDP, because in the long run, wages and other input prices rise and fall to match changes in the price level. So, price level changes do not affect firms' profits, and thus they create no incentive for firms to alter their output. There are three main determinants of aggregate supply: input prices, productivity, and legal and institutional environment. When these change, so does aggregate supply. Factors such as the prices of domestic and foreign resources and market power determine input prices. When these rise, aggregate supply falls, and the AS curve shifts to the left. When productivity increases, so does aggregate supply, and the AS curve shifts to the right. When taxes go up or there is more government regulation, aggregate supply falls and the AS curve shifts to the left. Increases in aggregate supply correspond to the shifts of the AS curve to the right, while decreases in aggregate supply shift the AS curve to the left. Macroeconomic equilibrium occurs at the price level that equalizes the amount of real output demanded and supplied. The equilibrium point is the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve. This intersection determines the equilibrium price level and equilibrium real output. Consider an example. When price level goes from 108 to 92, real output demanded rises accordingly from $506 to $514 billion. The same change in the price level corresponds to real output supplied, increasing from $513 to $502 billion. Equilibrium occurs at price level of 100, at which both output demanded and output supplied are equal to $510 billion. Graphically, macroeconomic equilibrium occurs at the point where the AD curve intersects the AS curve. At this equilibrium point, price level is an equilibrium price level, and real output is an equilibrium real output. We can use the AD-AS model to explain inflation and recession. When aggregate supply and aggregate demand change, inflation and recession can occur in the short run. Demand pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand increases. AD curve shifts to the right. Cost push inflation occurs when the costs of production rise. AS curve shifts to the left. Recession occurs when aggregate demand falls. AD curve shifts to the left, and prices are sticky downwards. Graphically, the increase of aggregate demand from AD to AD1 moves the economy to higher price and higher real output, causing demand pull inflation of P1 to P2. It also causes a positive GDP gap of Q1 minus QF. A leftward shift of aggregate supply from AS to AS1 raises the price level from P1 to P2 and produces cost push inflation. Real output declines, and a negative GDP gap of Q1 minus QF occurs. If the price level is downwardly inflexible, a decline of aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2 will move the economy from A to B and reduce real GDP from QF to Q2. Idle production capacity, cyclical unemployment, and a negative GDP gap of Q1 minus QF will result.